The morning they delivered the cedar posts, it was a Tuesday in November of 1987, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter by 6:30. I remember the temperature had not climbed above 19 degrees by the time the flatbed rolled up the county road, loaded down with 840 hand-split cedar posts, 2 spools of 4-point barbed wire, and 60 panels of woven wire fencing that the driver said had been cut to a non-standard height nobody else had wanted. The posts were rough split, not turned, and they smelled like the inside of a church that had been closed a long time. My neighbor Gerald had been out checking his own cattle that morning, and he pulled his truck up to the fence line where I was standing and watched the flatbed for a minute without saying anything. Then he rolled his window down and asked me what I was doing with 800 cedar posts and 60 panels of short fence on a piece of ground that was, by his accounting, already fenced adequate. I told him I was fencing the cedar brake. He looked at the cedar brake, which was a long, low strip of juniper and cedar that ran along the northwest corner of my place for about 3/4 of a mile, and he looked back at me and he said, politely, the way Gerald always said things, that it seemed like a considerable amount of money and labor to fence something that was mostly shade and brush. I told him I appreciated the observation. He nodded and drove on. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. They had me fencing the cedar brake to give my cattle a place to sleep out of the sun, which in November struck most people as a puzzling priority. I want to be honest about my reasons, because they were not the reasons most people would have used. I was not fencing that cedar brake because I had done some modern calculation on a spreadsheet, or because some extension agent had shown up with a clipboard and a laminated chart and told me wind mitigation was worth a certain number of dollars per animal unit per winter. No extension agent had been out to my place that fall. The one who covered our county that year was a decent enough fellow named Burl, and Burl had come by in September and looked at my cattle numbers and told me my stocking rate was about right for the available forage, and that I might consider a rotational system on my south pasture. And then he drove off in a clean, white half-ton that had never had a scratch on it. Burl did not say a word about the cedar brake, and I did not bring it up. I was not ready to explain it yet, because I had not yet worked it all the way out in my own head, and I had learned from my grandmother, who was a woman of considerable precision, that you do not explain a thing out loud until you can explain it all the way to the end without stopping. My real reason was my grandfather's notebook. I need to tell you about that notebook, because it is the center of this whole story, and everything else I am going to tell you orbits around it the way fence lines orbit around water. My grandfather had farmed and ranched this same ground from 1931 until his death in 1974. He had come onto the place when it was raw and broke, and the grass was thin from years of wrong management, and he had spent 43 years learning it in the way that a man learns a language he did not grow up speaking, slowly and with a great deal of quiet attention to what the ground and the animals were telling him. He kept a marbled composition book, the old kind with black and white covers and a cloth spine, and he wrote in it with a brown pencil that had been sharpened so many times it was down to about 3 inches when he died. The handwriting was small and careful, the way men of that generation wrote when paper was not something you wasted. My father had kept the notebook in a flat cedar chest in the barn under a piece of oilcloth, and when my father died in the spring of 1983, it passed to me along with the deed and the debts and one good John Deere tractor that needed a head gasket. I had read the notebook twice in those 4 years since my father died, but I had not read it the way it deserved to be read, which is slowly, with a lamp on, and nothing else demanding your attention. I had read it the way you read something when you are too close to a grief to fully settle into what the dead person was actually saying. I will own that. What finally slowed me down enough to read it right was a night in late October of 1987, a cold night with no moon, when I was sitting in the barn after a long day, and the cattle were settled, and the place was quiet, in the way it only gets quiet about an hour before midnight. I pulled the notebook out of the cedar chest, and I opened it to a page near the back, somewhere in the late 1950s. By the date my grandfather had written in the margin, and I found a passage about the cedar break that I had passed over both times before without understanding what it was telling me. My grandfather had written in his small, careful hand that in the winter of 1957 to 1958, which had been a hard winter by any measure, he had noticed that the cattle he found alive in the northwest corner of the place in the mornings, the ones that had worked their way into the cedar break on their own during the overnight hours, were in markedly better condition than the cattle he found in the open pastures. He had written that the open pasture cattle were burning weight at a rate he estimated at close to 1.5 pounds per day during the worst cold snaps, and the cattle that had spent the night in the break were holding much closer to even. He had written down several temperatures, specific ones: 14 below on the 2nd of January, 1958, 11 below on the 7th, 8 below on the 9th, and he had noted which groups of cattle were where during each of those nights and what condition they were in come morning. And then, at the bottom of that page, in handwriting that was slightly larger than the rest, as if he had wanted to make sure whoever came after him would not miss it, he had written this: "The break does not just stop the wind. It holds the heat the animals make themselves. Worth every post. Never tear it out." I sat with those words for a long time that night. Never tear it out. My grandfather had been dead for 13 years by then, and here he was telling me something specific and technical and true. And the reason I was only now fully hearing it was that I had not been quiet enough to listen before. I put the notebook back under the oilcloth, turned off the barn light, and walked back to the house in the dark, and I thought about those words the whole way. Worth every post. I thought about the fact that the cedar break on the northwest corner of my place was the original cedar break, the one that had been there before my grandfather, before his father, before anyone who had farmed this ground. And I thought about how close I had come in 1984 to having it pushed out so I could run that corner into my main pasture rotation. I had talked to a man about it. He had given me a price on a dozer. I had not done it, but not for any reason I am especially proud of. I had not done it because the price was higher than I wanted to pay that particular spring, and so the break had stayed. And now, 3 years later, I was sitting in a barn, reading my dead grandfather's notebook, and understanding for the first time what I had almost done. The next morning I was out before 5, before the sun had even suggested itself on the eastern edge of the place, and I walked the cedar break from the northeast corner to the southwest corner and back again. I had done this walk 100 times in my life, but I had never done it with the specific purpose of understanding what the break was doing for the ground and the animals. When you walk a piece of ground with a question in your mind, you see things you do not see when you walk it without one. What I saw that morning was that the break was roughly 300 yards wide at its widest point and narrowed to about 90 yards at the southwest end. The trees were old cedars and junipers, the biggest of them probably 60 or 70 years old, their canopies interlocking so thickly at the center that the ground underneath was nearly dry even after a rain. The northwest face of the break, the face that looked into the prevailing winter wind, was a near solid wall of interlocked branches from about 6 feet off the ground all the way up to perhaps 22 or 23 feet. When I stood inside the break and faced northwest, I could hear the wind working in the tops of the trees, but at ground level there was almost nothing. The air inside was still, not just calmer, still. And it was, I noticed, warmer, not by much, but by something you could feel on the exposed skin of your face. What I also saw that morning was that the cattle had no reliable way to use the break in a managed fashion. The old fence along the north side of the cedar break had been put up sometime in the late 1940s, my best guess, and it was two-strand barbed wire strung on cedar posts that had been rotting at the ground line for at least 20 years. Several sections had gone down entirely. The cattle could get into the break, but they could not be reliably directed there, and they could not be kept there if you wanted to control grazing pressure on the rest of the pasture. What my grandfather had observed in 1957 and 1958 was cattle using the break on their own instinct, getting into it because they knew to, not because anyone had designed the system. And I thought about that. I thought about the fact that the cattle had known, on their own, in 14 below weather, to go to the place that would hold the heat they made. The animals knew something about that ground that no one had ever properly put a fence around. Worth every post. And so I called about cedar posts the following Monday, and the flatbed showed up that Tuesday in November. And Gerald pulled his truck up to the fence line and asked me what I was doing. That fence took me and my son, who was 17 that fall, from the second week of November through the first week of December to put up. We set posts every 8 feet along the north face of the break, and every 10 feet along the east and west returns, and we ran woven wire to a height of 52 inches with 2 strands of barbed wire above it. And we put a solid corner assembly at each of the 4 angles using a brace design my grandfather had sketched in the back of that notebook. A design I had never seen in any fencing manual, but which, when I built it exactly as he had drawn it, was the most solid corner I have ever put in the ground. The total material cost, including posts, wire, staples, hardware for the corners, and 2 new gate sets, came to $418. The labor was my own and my son's, and we did not count it. When we finished, I had a fenced enclosure of approximately 42 acres of cedar and juniper brake on the northwest corner of my place, with a 12-foot gate on the south face and a 10-foot gate on the east face, so I could move cattle in and out without working against the wind. I stood at the south gate the evening we finished and looked at what we had built, and I thought about my grandfather standing somewhere near this same spot in the winter of 1957, watching his cattle come out of the break in the mornings in better shape than the ones he had left in the open, and writing it down in small, careful handwriting so that whoever came after him would know. The break held about 60 head, comfortably, which was roughly a third of my total cow herd at that time. My plan going into the winter of 1987 to 1988 was to rotate the heaviest and most vulnerable animals, the late-bred cows, the oldest cows, the cows that were carrying their first calf, into the break during the nights when the forecast called for temperatures below 10 degrees or wind chills below 0. I had a thermometer mounted on the north post of my barn, and I had a small battery-powered radio that I kept on the workbench, tuned to the weather station out of Amarillo. And I had my grandfather's notebook, which I had been reading more carefully than I had read anything in years. The fall of 1987 had been dry, which was typical, and the winter forecast from the Extension Service was for a normal to slightly below normal temperature range with precipitation near average. Burl had mentioned something along those lines when I had seen him at the co-op in October. I had not asked him about the cedar break. I was not going to ask Burl about the cedar break. The winter of 1987 to 1988 started the way most winters start on that piece of ground, which is slowly and then all at once. December was cold but manageable, highs in the 20s some days, dropping to single digits a few nights, nothing the cattle could not handle in the open with good feed and water. I used the break for the oldest cows and a small group of thin first calf heifers on the coldest nights, and by the time Christmas had passed, I had a clear sense of what the enclosure was doing. On a night when the open pasture cattle were burning energy to stay warm, the cattle in the break were standing quiet, not bunched tight, the way cattle bunch in open-air cold, not moving to generate heat. They were standing loose and easy, and the calmer they were, the less they ate and the less weight they burned. I did not have a scale in the field, but I had my eyes, and the difference between a cow that is working to stay warm and a cow that is not is a difference you can see if you know what you are looking at. My grandfather had known what he was looking at. Worth every post. January of 1988 is when everything I had done began to matter in a way that went beyond my own operation. On the 14th of January, a Tuesday, a front came through that the weather radio had forecast as a significant winter storm event, and the forecast was, if anything, an understatement of what actually arrived. The temperature dropped from 31 degrees at 2 in the afternoon to 4 degrees by 8 that evening, and by midnight it was 11 below zero at my barn thermometer. The wind was out of the northwest at a sustained 32 miles per hour, with gusts I estimated at better than 50, which put the wind chill somewhere below, 40 below, by any calculation I trusted. The snow came horizontally, the kind of snow that has no interest in falling and every interest in moving sideways, and by 2 in the morning I could not see the far fence line of my home pasture from the barn door, which meant the visibility was under about 150 yards. I had moved 63 head into the cedar break the previous afternoon when the front was still 2 hours out and the sky had gone that particular shade of greenish gray that means the weather is not negotiating with you. I had left the rest of the herd, about 118 head of stronger mid-cycle cows, in the main pasture with access to the hay yard and a windbreak panel I had constructed along the south face of the barn. I will not tell you I was not worried about those 118. I was worried about them. But I had done what I knew to do, and what I knew to do was rooted in a notebook that had been written in small, careful handwriting 30 years before I needed it. At 4:30 in the morning, I put on everything I owned that was warm and walked out to check the break. The wind hit me when I came around the north side of the barn, and I will say plainly that it was the coldest air I have walked into voluntarily in my life. It took the moisture out of my eyes almost immediately, and by the time I got to the south gate of the cedar break, my eyelashes were stiff. I opened the gate and stepped inside, and what happened to the air when I crossed that fence line was not subtle. The wind that had been hitting me at 30+ miles per hour dropped to something I would estimate at 4 or 5 miles per hour, a light movement of air through the trees rather than a force moving against my body. The temperature inside the break, by my best reckoning from the way the cold was sitting on my skin, was something in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 degrees warmer than outside. In an 11 below night, that is not a small thing. That is the difference between cattle standing quiet and cattle in real metabolic trouble. The 63 head inside the break were standing loose and calm, not bunched, not moving. Their backs were dry, their breath was rising in slow, even columns above their heads, visible in the beam of my flashlight as white puffs that dissipated straight up rather than being torn sideways by wind. They were not fighting anything. The ground under them was dry because the canopy above was dense enough that the blowing snow was not penetrating to ground level inside the break. They had hay from the previous afternoon's feeding, and they had a 300-gallon tank with a float de-icer that my grandfather had wired into the break back in the 1960s. The wiring was old, and I had replaced it in November, but the float and the tank were the originals. My grandfather had thought about this. He had thought about it carefully enough to run a wire to a tank inside a cedar break 30 years before I needed it. I stood there with my flashlight in that still, comparative warmth, and I thought about him doing the same walk on the 2nd of January, 1958, and writing down what he saw. I did not stay long. I had 118 cattle to check in the open pasture, and they were going to need attention. Those cattle were alive, all of them. I want to say that clearly. They were alive, and eventually they were all right. But they were in real trouble that night, and the difference between the two groups was a difference I can still see in my memory as clearly as anything I have seen in 40 years of working this ground. The open pasture cattle were bunched into the southeast corner of the main pasture, which was the most sheltered corner available to them, pressed together as tight as cattle get. The outside animals turning their hindquarters to the wind, and the steam rising off the pile of them in a way that told you every animal was working as hard as it could just to hold its temperature. They were not calm. They were surviving. I broke hay for them and checked the tank heater and did what I could. And then I went back to the barn and stood there for a while thinking about the difference between surviving and not working at all to survive. We lost no cattle that night. I am grateful for that, and I do not take it lightly, because I know several operations in that county that did lose cattle in that storm, and I do not say what I am about to say to make any of those people feel worse about choices that were reasonable choices by any normal standard. I am saying it only because it is what happened, and because it is the point of this story. When the storm broke on the morning of the 16th, I spent the better part of that day doing a body condition and weight estimate assessment on both groups of cattle by eye. The 63 head that had been in the Cedar break through the 2 worst nights of that storm were, by my estimate, down an average of somewhere between a ½ pound and 3/4 pound per head over the duration. The open pasture cattle, the 118 that had weathered it in the main pasture, were down what I estimated at an average of 2½ to 3 pounds per head. That is a rough number, an eye estimate, not a scale weight. But I have been estimating body condition on cattle for 40 years, and I was not far wrong. The difference over a 2-night storm at weaning and sale time in a market that paid by the pound was not a small difference. It was a difference that showed up in the fall when I ran those cattle across the scale at the sale barn, and it showed up in the check I took home, and the numbers were consistent with what my grandfather had written in the winter of 1957 to 1958. And the numbers agreed with each other in a way that made me feel the old man had been waiting 30 years for someone to do the arithmetic. A man named Harlan, who had been a county soil and watershed conservationist for something like 34 years, and who had seen more bad winters on this high ground than I had, came out to look at my operation in the February following that storm. He was not young, probably 67 or 68 years old at the time, and he had the kind of quiet that comes from having been wrong about a few things and right about more, and not needing to announce either one. I showed him the break, walked him through it, showed him the corner brace design from my grandfather's notebook, showed him the tank and the original float de-icer wiring. He did not say much. He walked the north face of the break and looked at the canopy and pressed his hand flat against the bark of one of the largest cedars, and then he stood for a while looking northwest across the open country that the wind had been coming from in January. He asked me how the cattle inside had done compared to the cattle in the open, and I told him my eye estimate numbers. He was quiet for a moment that ran long enough that I was not sure he was going to say anything. Then he said, in the way a man says something when he has finally seen what he expected to see, but did not expect to see this well, that the thermal retention in a mature enclosed cedar break of this density was, in his experience, exceptional. That was the word he used. Exceptional. And then he said he had not seen a corner brace design quite like the one in my grandfather's notebook, and he wanted to know if he could make a drawing of it. I told him he could. Gerald came by in the 3rd week of February, after the ground had firmed back up enough to drive on. He pulled up along the same fence line where he had watched the cedar post flatbed roll in back in November. He sat in his truck for a moment and looked out at the place, and then he rolled his window down. He asked me how the cattle in the cedar break had wintered. I told him the numbers, the ones I just told you, the rough estimate on the weight difference between the two groups. He looked out at the break for a while without saying anything, and then he said, without ceremony and without any particular expression that I could read, that the northwest corner of his place had a cedar break not too different from mine, and that maybe the following fall he would think about what kind of fence he wanted to put around it. Then he rolled his window up and drove on. Gerald was not a man who said much, and what he had said was about as close to a reckoning as he was ever going to offer on the subject, and I understood it for what it was, and I appreciated it for what it was, and I did not say anything to anyone about it. I went back to the barn that evening, and I got the notebook out of the cedar chest, and I opened it to the page with my grandfather's account of the winter of 1957 to 1958, and I read it again. It had not changed. It was the same small, careful handwriting, the same temperatures recorded in the margin, the same note about the cattle coming out of the break in better condition than the ones in the open, and at the bottom, in handwriting slightly larger than the rest, the same words: "Worth every post. Never tear it out." I had read those words many times by then, but I want to tell you that the difference between reading a thing and understanding a thing is the distance between your eyes and your life, and sometimes that distance takes years to cross. My grandfather had crossed it by himself in the winter of 1958, working alone with a brown pencil and a composition book, trying to leave something useful for whoever came after him. He had not known who that would be. He had written it anyway, which is a form of generosity that I find harder to hold in my mind the older I get, because it asks for nothing back. He had written it carefully and left it under a piece of oilcloth in a cedar chest in a barn on a piece of ground that he trusted someone would still be working after he was gone, and he had been right, and the words had arrived at the moment they were needed, which is the only thing you can ask of any inheritance. The full material cost of fencing that cedar break, as I said, was $418. The labor was mine and my son's, and I did not count it. What that $418 returned in the difference in cattle condition over the first hard winter, in the reduction of supplemental feed I needed to push to the cattle in the break compared to the cattle in the open, and in the recovered weight and body condition that came through in my sale weights that fall, is a number I am not going to give you precisely, because I do not want you to think this is a story about arithmetic. It is not a story about arithmetic. It is a story about paying attention, which is the only real capital a person accumulates on this kind of ground over this kind of time. My grandfather had paid attention in 1958 and written it down. I had paid attention in 1987 and built a fence. My son, who is now in his mid-50s and still working part of this ground, knows where the notebook is and has read it the way it deserves to be read, slowly and with a lamp on, and I believe he understands the same thing I eventually came to understand, which is that inherited knowledge is not a sentiment. It is a technical document. It is a set of observations recorded by someone who had nothing to gain from being wrong and no reason to write it down, except that they thought it might be useful to someone they would never meet. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. I have thought over the years since that storm about what would have happened if I had taken the dozer price in 1984 and pushed that cedar breakout and run the ground into my pasture rotation. I would have gained about 42 acres of grazable ground, which at the carrying capacity of this country would have been worth somewhere between 8 and 10 additional cow-calf pairs per year, depending on the precipitation. That is not nothing. That is real money on a small operation. But I would have gone into the winter of 1988 with every animal I owned in the open, and I would have spent the night of January 14th standing in a field in 11 below wind chill, doing what I could for 181 head of cattle with nothing between them and the Northwest except fence wire and distance. I do not know exactly what that winter would have cost me, but I know what it cost the people around me who did not have what I had, and I know that what I had cost $418 and a November's worth of fence work and 43 years of one man's careful attention to a piece of ground he loved, worth every post. My grandfather wrote that about a cedar brake he spent his working life inside of, on ground he farmed from the time it was raw until the time he was finished. And he was right in a way that reached past his own death and landed exactly where it needed to land, which was in the hands of the person who came after him on a quiet night in late October in a barn that still smelled faintly of the man who had built it. I have tried to pay the same kind of attention he paid, and I have tried to write down what I notice in the same kind of notebook, with the same conviction that it will mean something to whoever comes after me, even if they do not read it the right way the first time. Especially if they do not read it the right way the first time, because most of the best things take a few passes before they land. If you are working a piece of ground that has something on it that looks like it might just be shade or brush or an inconvenience to the fence lines, I would ask you to sit with it a while before you make a decision. The land holds information the way those old cedars hold heat, quietly and without announcing itself. And the animals know it before we do. Walk the thing in the dark on a cold night before you push it out. Read whatever the people before you left behind, slowly, with a lamp on. The old knowledge is patient. It will wait for you to be quiet enough to hear it, and when you finally are, it will tell you something exact and useful and true. That is the only lesson I have that is worth passing on, and it is not mine. I received it from a man who is gone, written in brown pencil in small, careful handwriting in a marbled composition book under a piece of oilcloth in a cedar chest in a barn I still use every day, and I am only passing it on the way he passed it on, with the same hope that whoever needs it will eventually be still enough to find it. If you have your own piece of old ground, or your own cedar brake, or your own marbled notebook from someone who came before you and tried to leave you something useful, I would be grateful to hear about it in the comments. This channel moves slow by design, because the things that are worth knowing on this kind of ground do not arrive in a hurry. Subscribe if something here meant something to you. We will be back with more of the same, which is to say, more of the slow and careful thing, which is the only kind I know how to do.